Hey folks, Dr. Mike Israetel here for Renaissance Periodization. Is the overhead press bad for delt growth? Ooh, how could he? What a controversial way to start the day. Well, before we begin to scientifically deconstruct the overhead press, I have to say a few things. I love the overhead press. I'm in love with the overhead press. One of the people I look to most in this world for everything guidance is Zydrunas Savickas, multi-time world strongest man, probably one of the best, if not the best, overhead pressers of all time. I trained overhead press for years and years and years. I was genetically gifted at it. And some number of years ago, when I peaked in my overhead pressing, mostly because I just stopped training it afterwards, I got very, very good at it. And Scott, the video guy, will hopefully pop up a video here that shows me overhead pressing 275 pounds at a body weight of just over 240, standing full range of motion for 8 reps. Gee whiz, that's very good, right? I'll pat myself on the back if I could reach it. But the overhead press is awesome. It is a spirit exercise, and it's an amazing exercise for just making you nonsense strong and really strong in the real world. You show me a guy who can overhead press, 225 for a set of 10, standing, and I'm just like, man, I don't want to fuck with that guy. That's a real world strong ass human being. However, it's a very different question than what it does for delt size. So let's take a look. Just from a real first level analysis, delt training via the overhead press has a couple of features. First, it trains, due to angle of push, the front delts significantly more than any other exercise and better than any other exercise. So if you want unreal front delt hypertrophy, the overhead barbell press is a very good place to start. Now, when people say delts, they don't usually just mean front delts. They mean side delts and rear delts. And the side delts get trained somewhat during the overhead press, but other exercises like, even upright rows and all kinds of laterals, even front raises engage your side delts more than overhead presses, okay? Even on raw stimulus magnitude, the amount of sheer stimulus, forget about fatigue, usually it's better for side delts in like 10 other exercises than overhead press. So if you consider the overhead press overall delt growth, yeah, you're right about front delts, maybe not so right about side delts. On the stimulus to fatigue ratio, because especially standing barbell presses create so much spinal loading and so much requisite for stability, the fatigue is really high. And the stimulus to fatigue ratio of almost any other delt exercise is usually better than overhead barbell presses. Not great. Now, third point is the worst. People say, oh, I need big delts, I'm going to do overhead press. It basically doesn't train the rear delts at all. So saying, hey, I've got delts, I'm going to train delts. Here's a delt exercise, overhead press. What do you think of overhead press for delt hypertrophy? It's not the best way to phrase that question, because for overall delt hypertrophy, the overhead press is just not that great. It trains the front delts very well, but everything else, meh. All right, so just to frame that. Last 2 slides, we're going to go through a question and answer system of reasons that you could train the overhead press and reasons that you probably shouldn't. So can you still use the overhead press? Lots of you are probably panicking right now and going, oh my God, Dr. Mike, but I love the overhead press. Can I still use it? Well, here's the thing. If you want to grow your triceps and front delts, yes, the overhead press is a very good thing to use. If you get a very good side delt pump, disruption, soreness, etc., from overhead presses, then yes, they're a great exercise even for side delts. If you get a good stimulus to fatigue ratio, so not only is the stimulus good, but the fatigue is minimal for overhead presses for all those things, number 1 and 2, then yes, again, the answer is that it's good to train overhead press. However, standing presses, which is generally what people say when they say overhead press, because of the axial fatigue, the spinal loading, they are so often highly fatiguing that the stimulus to fatigue ratio is usually not great. But we can fix that. So point number 4, yes, you can train the overhead press, especially if you modify the overhead press for a higher stimulus to fatigue ratio for your shoulders. How do you do that? First, do them seated versus standing. I'm not a big fan of seated barbell overhead presses. There's something manly that's removed from the exercise, specifically the standing upright. But as far as stimulus to fatigue ratio, you get much less compressive force traveling through your legs, much less requisite for stability. If you're seated, you get the same or higher, because you're stable, stimulus for the delts seated, but you get less fatigue. So it's usually a better approach. And it's one of the things that there's nothing in my heart makes me happy to say that, but that's just the way it is. Next point is keep the load close to your face. If you push the barbell out this way, it's more front delts, triceps, less side delts because the side delts don't work this way. The side delts keep the bar close to your face, pushing up and back. As soon as you clear your head, push back and out. Make sure you're seated in a position that which you don't fall backwards like that, and then you will hit your side delts better, your traps better. It's not just all front delts. That's very good. And the last thing is, given that you're already overhead pressing, given that you're doing it in a technique which stimulates the side delts more, my recommendation is to do a bunch of side delt work before you even overhead press and maybe do it last, maybe even supersetted. So for example, you do a bunch of seated laterals with dumbbells. Your side delts are fried as fuck. Put down the dumbbells, take the bar out, and do overhead presses. Your side delts are so close to local muscular failure, they will instantly be the limiting factor in this overhead press you're doing as the second exercise of a superset is now a very good stimulus to fatigue ratio exercise for those side delts. Or if you do it fresh, it's mostly front delt. Give that some thought if you want to overhead press, and you may still be able to do it if you love it, if you do it properly in the ways described. Now, what about reasons you shouldn't be doing an overhead press in your program? First, if you don't need a lot of front delt focus, if your front delts, honest assessment, are big, your side delts need more work, rear delts need way more work, your arms, your chest, etc., your front delts are just big for your physique, it's gratifying to do overhead pressing because you're probably really good at it because you have big-ass front delts, but you probably also don't need it. So from a physique perspective, don't overhead presses if your front delts don't need a lot of work, right? I haven't overhead pressed in a really long time because my front delts are just fine, and I have other places to put my efforts to make my muscles bigger where they're actually needed. If you want lots of side delt growth, but you feel a ton of front delt activation, soreness, disruption, etc., and a ton of front delt and tricep in your overhead pressing, then as an honest assessment, if someone says, hey, you're overhead pressing, you're trying to get big delts, you're like, yes. Like, do you feel it in your delts? You're like, front delts and triceps. Are like, right. Don't you want side delt growth? You're like, yes. But you're right that this exercise clearly doesn't stimulate those a lot. If that's the case for you, if you feel a lot of front delts, triceps, not a lot of side delts and overhead press, it's not your number one exercise. It's not even your number 5 exercise, right? So maybe you can put it away until and unless you want to use it. And lastly, and this is a big one, if you get a really bad stimulus to fatigue ratio on them, I wouldn't recommend using them, especially if the modifications from the last side to increase your SFR just didn't work all that well. A lot of times we stick to exercises because we like to do them, because we're strong at them, because we like the progression, or because we consider them core exercises that define our manliness and shit. Like, I can't not squat, bench, deadlift, overhead press, and do pull-ups. Like, fuck that. Like, I got to be a man and do that shit. Yeah, sure, if that means a lot to you, hey, listen, do it. But if you want just pure hypertrophy and pure strength in the most efficient ways possible, you're going to have to jettison some of that attachment to manliness and all those lifts and lifts you loved and lifts you're good at. Like, I was incredible at overhead pressing. I loved doing it. The problem was I would do it. It would take me 30 minutes to do the whole exercise with all the warming up and the huge fatigue and huge long rest times between sets. I was thinking, for 30 minutes of effort and a crap load of fatigue, the lower back stuff would interfere with my squatting, interfere with my good mornings. The central drive, I would get quad cramps pressing the top of the rep because my whole body was contracting. I just thought, gee whiz, for all this fatigue, the stimulus just really isn't worth it. And it was painful to have to get rid of them. But now I've gotten rid of them. And I only think about them sometimes. Sundays, when it's cloudy outside or rainy, I'm curled up with a book. And sometimes I think, I wonder what overhead presses are doing right now. Maybe they're at a really loud club with their hot date. And maybe they're sort of like scrolling through their phone and, hey, what's up, date? Hey, guys. And they're pretending to scroll through Instagram, but they're really thinking about me. Just maybe. Hey, overhead presses, if you're out there, no pressure, just, hey. See you guys next time. Hey, folks, want exercises and styles of doing them that really maximize your side delt size? Check this video out and you'll have side delts so big that, well, gee whiz, they'll just be real big.